Thank you very much indeed. Let me start by saying how sorry I am, A, not to be in Newcastle, which I had hoped to be, and B, that actually I have missed much of the day's action since I've had to stay here in order to appoint a bursar, and that ended up taking 7 hours of my life. But it's a great pleasure to be able to join you at the end of the day. And I know a little bit about what was said earlier, and there will be at least some contact between what I said and what others have said. Let me, first of all, properly share my screen. Okay. I wrote this paper last week and then opened last Saturday's Guardian to read this, an article about an Italian photographer called Morelli. This article seemed to be apropos of nothing, except that the Guardian wanted to print this picture, I think. So this Italian photographer some years ago made a visit to a naturist village in southern France, and the Guardian says that he came to believe that living without clothes flattens any socioeconomic difference. We can become so accustomed to characterizing and stereotyping and presenting ourselves in a way that defines our status, but that is all taken away. You focus less on form and more on quality human interactions. This seemed to me absolutely to sum up the point that I want to make about the way in which clothes stereotype and present. Though I also realize that perhaps it's a good idea that I am on Zoom and not in the room, since presumably the only possible conclusion to draw from Morelli's observation is that you'll get a much better discussion if you all take your clothes off. When it comes, let me try and to the materiality of identity, there's more to learn, I think, from a single episode of Queer Eye than from any academic paper. So if you've never seen Queer Eye, tune out now, get your Netflix subscription quick and binge. And don't forget, there's a German Queer Eye too, with subtitles, great way of learning German. The whole plot of Queer Eye depends on identities being materialized. If you want to turn someone's life around, you allow them to be the person they could, be, you need to change their physical environment, you need to change their wardrobe, and you need to give them a good haircut. Once you've done that, within a week, you have a different person with a different potential for action. If what the Queer Eye team do is detect what the individual really wants to be, and give them the outward identity that enables them to be that, tracing back identities from their materialization in the ancient world is a matter of starting with the outward identity and then reading back what the individual was enabled or constrained to be by that public face. Our best hope of understanding this comes from representations in which we can both identify the actions and relationships that are involved and observe how the individuals involved in those actions and relationships present themselves in material terms. While representations that can be linked to an individual, as in ancient portraits, give an indication of how that individual wanted themselves to be identified, representations that cannot be so linked have some advantage when it comes to recognizing what is at stake in a particular stylistic choice. Both representations of anonymous individuals and representations of mythological characters are valuable here, with mythological characters having the advantage that we can know their story. All the identities I shall be concerned with are fictional, in as far as they're projected by sculptors and painters, not by historic individuals. But these fictions have the advantage that we can be sure that what we're seeing was consciously created, a choice had to be made by the person representing of exactly what they were going to show. And I start with what might be reckoned an official fiction, the Parthenon frieze. As plans of the frieze, like to point out, the figures on the frieze fall into various groups: riders, chariots, elders, musicians, carriers, women, magistrates or tribal heroes, gods. Some of these groups manifest considerable uniformity. So the young men who are carrying water jars all wear a himation without a chiton, although one displays the right-hand side of the upper part of his torso, whereas his companions have all but the shoulder covered. The metic tray carriers seem to have been similarly dressed. We rely on Carré's drawings for most of what we know of these figures. The magistrates, however, and the eponymous heroes on the east frieze, who also wear just the himation, wear a himation where the material is notably lighter, forming more numerous folds. And although some wear it covering one shoulder, others wear it simply round the waist, exposing the body. This contrasts with the male musicians on the north side, again, best known from Carré's drawings, since the slab is now damaged, who wear a chiton as well as a himation, and whose upper bodies are very well covered. The women on the east frieze, who carry various ritual instruments, fialae and incense burner, variously wear linen chiton plus himation, or woolen peplos plus mantle, or even chiton plus peplos. It doesn't seem correct to talk of a uniform for each of these different roles, but there's certainly a sense of the sort of clothing that's appropriate being different in each of these different cases. We might contrast the gods. None of the male gods, young or old, wears more than the himation. And in several cases, this is worn round the waist, leaving the upper body and lower legs bare. None of the female deities has her arms covered. They wear more in the case of Demeter, or less in the case of Artemis and Aphrodite, more or less heavy chitons without himatia, and variously draw attention to their clothing, particularly Hera, who unveils herself, and Artemis, who appears to be sort of holding her clothes up, her chiton up, in case it falls down. Pose further characterizes them, with Aphrodite, in particular, distinguished by her laid-back attitude. It's not hard to see why the gods are different. For all that they appear together, they are not there as representatives of a group, as we might think of the metic tray bearers as being, nor there to perform a particular role that's independent of their everyday life, as the musicians are. The gods are there as themselves, and the whole point of a polytheistic religion is that the gods are all different. By the language of their dress, by the attributes they carry, Ares' spear or Demeter's torch, and by their body language, they both identify themselves in the most basic sense, enable us to see which one is Aphrodite, which one is Artemis, and which one is Demeter, and so on. And they tell us something about their identity in a more subtle sense. The East Pediment, with its opposition between Demeter on the south side and Aphrodite on the north, took this identity projection a step further. So you've got the contrasts on the screen with the Aphrodite of the frieze juxtaposed at the top right to the Aphrodite of the East Pediment north side and to the seated figures of Demeter and Corre, rather differently presented to Aphrodite on the south side of the East Pediment. Against this background, the representation of the Athenian cavalryman is particularly fascinating. Far from the Athenian cavalry presenting a uniform, let alone uniformed appearance, they offer a very wide range of dress and attitude. There are those who present a body naked but for a mantle around the neck, flying in the wind. There are those who wear a short sleeveless tunic, or tunic plus mantle, or a short sleeved tunic. Some wear a Thracian hat, bottom left, for instance. Others, Thracian boots. One on the west frieze top on the screen, wears a cuirass over a tunic, along with a crested helmet. Yet most, other than a small number with beards, have indistinguishable youthful faces. There's a play going on here with personal identity. These men have wealth in common. They wouldn't be members of the Hippies if they didn't. So we're not seeing class position as distinguished by dress. Rather, we're seeing how, when asked to put on a display, young Athenian men might show off. Some show off by wearing more or wearing the exotic, others by wearing less. Youth is certainly a liberating factor here. That young men experimented with clothing as a way of materializing their identity is even more strongly indicated by the scenes on a vessel used for cooling wine, attributed to the painter Smikros, now in the J. Paul Getty Museum at Malibu. On one side are two figures named Euphronius and Leagros. Those are both familiar names. Euphronius is the name of a contemporary pot painter, Leagros, the favourite kalos name of the period. Both wear somewhat diaphanous hematia, and only hematia, leaving the right shoulder bare. But they wear the hemation in different ways. Leagros's hemation is wound round the waist. Euphronius's hemation is thrown over his shoulder. Euphronius leans on a stick and extends his arms to Leagros's face. Leagros extends his arms to Euphronius's stick. These gestures are ambiguous, perhaps a cautiously arm's-length amatory approach, perhaps ensuring that physical distance is kept. By contrast, there can be no doubt about the amatory intentions of the unnamed couple to the right of Leagros. The figure on the left wears his hemation in the same style as Euphronius, but has hooked his left arm around the slightly smaller figure and reaches out with his right to the exposed genitals of that figure, whose hemation is draped only round his shoulders. The two look into each other's eyes, and their mouths approach, apparently to kiss. To the right of these, the beautiful Hegerthos kalos is written on the pot, leans on his stick. His hemation is draped around his shoulders and he extends his right arm towards Andriscus. Andriscus, too, has his hemation merely draped round his neck, but his hemation is purple and his hair in a bun. He reaches with his right arm gently to touch the arm of Hegerthus, while his left hand hovers, as if uncertain whether to grasp the extended hand of Hegerthus. To the right of these again are two figures engaged with themselves rather than each other. The large Ambrosius is naked and scraping himself down with a strigil. The small Euthydemus is folding up his hemation, presumably in order to participate in the gym. But if this pair identify themselves as devotees of physical display, the pair on their right raise the question of the attractions of musical culture. Melas has managed somehow to make his hemation self-supporting, rolled up under his left armpit. He raises his left hand to his head and places his right hand on his bare waist, apparently in imitation of his smaller companion Antias, who seems to have his right hand similarly placed, but on this occasion, underneath the hemation, which is wrapped all around him, totally concealing his entire body except for head, ankles, and feet, and a left forearm which holds a lyre. It even forms a sort of hood behind the back of his head. The exchange of glances between the two figures rather implies that Melas has attracted Antias's attention by making some remark. Faced with any one of these figures, the identity they have materialized by presenting in this way would be hard to construe. But the company that these figures keep helps us to understand how material is here being used. The embrace of the unnamed couple guarantees that the question of erotic relationships is the question here. Those two unashamed lovers make the naked male body an undoubted object of sexual desire. The young boy's decision not to wear his hemation but simply to drape it across his shoulders, is a decision to put on display the body that will attract erotic attention. Once we see that, we see that Hegerthus and Andriscus too are looking to attract attention. Hegerthos' kalos name perhaps indicates that he is known as pretty boy. Andriscus is out to compete and does so with colour, a reminder that the materiality of clothing is not just about the weight of the fabric or how it falls around or clings to the body, how sheer it is, but also about its colour and decoration. The in-your-face grabbing of erotic attention of this pair puts the restraint of Euphronius and Leagros into perspective. They may have chosen not their heaviest himatia, but they put no more flesh on view than does any man wearing a himation when in action. They choose to attract not by the bodies they flash, but by the care with which they have put themselves together. This is a distinctly soigné look. That's not the case with Melas and Antias. Melas's himation is too virtuoso in its arrangement to be soigné, and Melas has gone for complete cover-up. He likes to be admired for the music he produces from his lyre, but if he wishes for erotic attention at all, he's playing hard to get. The would-be lover is offered the profile of a firm buttock, but beyond the fact that Antias has responded by looking back to give the minimum of come-ons, his desires remain inscrutable. One striking feature of Smikros' Sikter is that all the men involved are beardless, by contrast to the classic encounter of bearded man with a youth that's explored in the courtship iconographies identified by Beazley. Smicros's part transports us into a world where the attractions of the young male body are the focus of attention for young male bodies. We have homoeroticism explored here without the shadow either of power relations or pedagogy. The rewards of attracting others' attention in this homosocial peer group are purely erotic. What we see materialized are not so much fixed identities as the identity assumed in the moment in order to achieve the aims of the moment. We see the different ways in which erotic attention could be attracted and different ways of presenting oneself as an object of other young men's desire. From brazen bodily display through nonchalant exposure of wealthy tastes and bodily form, to natty dressing, to playing hard to get. Smikros Sikter introduces us to a world where dress and undress draw attention to the body. But not all dress works that way. This emerges clearly from the images of what are sometimes called bunas, or anacreontics. I show a cup, once again in the J. Paul Getty Museum at Malibu, and attributed to the Briseis painter. Both sides of this cup show men and women dancing and drinking to music played by female aulos players. One woman and one smaller female attendant wear simply a ketone, but all the other figures, male and female, wear both ketone and himation, and all wear a form of head covering, the sakos. The two women aulos players wear their himatia in pretty regular ways over their ketones. But the bearded men, several of whom sport himatia with fancy borders, deploy their himatia in a variety of ways. In one case as a sort of dance accessory, in another to wrap entirely around the body so that both arms disappear under the himation. The question of the identity of these men has been much discussed. Are they simply mimicking Dionysus, who's regularly shown in himation, in ketone as well as himation, as on this bell crater? Or are they transvestite, men playing women? Or are they adopting what they see as the style of foreigners, and in particular of Lydians? We need only pose the question like that to see that the answer cannot be either one or other of these options. a man, and in particular a bearded man, could not put on a ketone, a himation over his ketone and pick up a skyphos of wine without invoking images of Dionysus. But at the same time, to put on a sakos is to put on a head covering that's associated with women, and to carry a sunshade, or have one carried for one, is something that only women do. And to dress and behave like this amongst identically dressed women can only further emphasize just how feminine this way of dressing is. But this is not to dismiss the foreign overtone. For a man to dress in this feminized way is to evoke the lifestyle for which Anacreon had coined the term ludopathes. These are images in which the men send mixed signals. They signal that they're becoming like Dionysus. He's always to compromise one's Greekness. Dionysus, after all, is the god who has always only just arrived from the East. And it's also to compromise one's masculinity. There's a sentence in Philostratus Imagines, written many centuries later, this is Imagines 12298, when in a description of the Komos, Philostratus says, the Komos goes along with women behaving like men and putting on female clothing and female ways of walking. To be noted in these images is the absence of the body. By contrast to the young men on Smikros Sikter, all the figures on the Briseis painter's pot are completely covered up by their clothing. Not only are these clothes not diaphanous, they do not even reveal the contours of the body. Not even the form of a knee is in sight, in contrast to other images painted by the same painter. So here you've got British Museum E75. If dress on Smikros Sikter pointed to undress and to the body, on the Briseis painter's cup, dress points to dress. The identity acquired here is not a way of flaunting the body. It's a way of flagging up a type of behavior, a devotion to a particular sort of occasion, and a willingness to risk self-abandon. Whether or not Athenian men ever did dress up and behave like this or not doesn't affect how these images work. They offer to those at the symposium, drinking from these cups, a way of imagining what it will be if they let Dionysus do his work and release them from the bonds of their current identity. The Bunas then introduce us to a form of intersectionality. Race, or at least ethnicity, and gender clearly intersect here. And it is their intersection that makes this particular identity a powerful one. But ethnicity and gender also intersect here with class. Wearing a ketone under the himation involves not merely a gendered and ethnicized identity, it also says something about relationship to activity, and more particularly to labor. It's not for nothing that the men shown as Bunas are all bearded. They're men of a certain age, where their very beard offers them a male role which is not physically active. Young men prove their manhood by being appropriately groomed and dressed to engage in an active life in the gymnasium. Older men show their manhood in their beards. What marks Agathon apart in Aristophanes' Thesmophoria Zeusai is not merely that he dresses like a woman, but that he does so while unbearded. Euripides' in-law asks Euripides in that play, in questions that he admits to have borrowed from Aeschylus' Lycourgea, where they surely referred to Dionysus, whence comes this androgyne? What is his country, his dress? What contradictions his life shows? A lyre and a hairnet, a wrestling school, oil flask, and a girdle? What could be more contradictory? We would expect Agathon to wear clothing appropriate for those who are going to be active, given that he's a beardless young man, active in the gymnasium, active in music making, instead of which he has clothing which points to his being either female or foreign, someone not expecting to behave like an Athenian young man. If wearing the himation only is a mark of being a properly active man is also a mark of not being a labourer. Labourers don't merely need not to wear a ketone and to keep their hair short. They need to wear a hat, the pilos, to keep their hair out of their work, and the shortest of garments, the tribone, to least impede the movement of arms and legs, just as cavalrymen wear the very comparable but far classier short cloak known as the chlamys. The tribone is what Spartans wear, unless they've denied their manhood by returning defeated but alive from battle. It's also what Socrates and the later Cynic philosophers wear. Aristotle remarks of the Spartans that, this is Politics 1294b 28-9, the rich can get away with such clothing when the poor can't. And the implication of Xenophon's famous claim that one cannot tell apart citizens from slaves in Pseudo-Xenophon's Constitution of the Athenians 110 is that Athenian citizens too regularly wore the tribone, not the himation. Three famous pots, each the name vase of a different painter, show off the clothing of the labouring class. The foundry that gives the foundry painter his name has workers who are variously naked, except for a pilos, or with a garment tied around the waist to provide minimal coverage of their loins. This is a pot which plays with the relationship between statue and worker in terms of scale, in terms of headgear, whether you're wearing a helmet or a pilos, and in terms of bodily display. The labourer who strips to work, as Hesiod already has his farmer stripped to plough, alongside the warrior stripped not for practical purposes, but to display a body fit for a task in which in life it would have been clad in further metalwork. The comparison is further pointed out by the customer, if that's the right identification of the figure, leaning on his stick. He's in fact upside down on the picture that you see, so not easy to identify, who he's leaning on his stick, having to hand a strigil comparable to the instrument with which one of the workers scrapes down the warrior's leg next to him. So you have to sort of turn yourself on your heads, I'm afraid, to see that thoroughly. But these are the figures at the at as it were 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock. You can just see the scraping down going on here. The pig painter's name vase takes us into the country and shows the clothing options there. One figure, once more, has their garment tied around their waist. The other wears the short tribone along with the pilos. Although scholars have been tempted to name the characters here Odysseus and Eumaeus, no known incident is shown, and the wit of the piece lies in the way in which the encounter between the pigs and the relationship between the men relate to each other. Here are two men living pigs' lives. Are they going to compete as rivals or to befriend and assist each other? No such open question lies behind the scene that gives the Pan painter his name. A sexually excited Pan chases a goat herd through a sexually vibrant countryside. The goat herd sports striped socks, a tribone, a skin, a goat skin, and a pilos. Not only is the goat god herding the goat herd, but the goat herd, whose reputation for bestiality would be foregrounded in later pastoral poetry, is threatened with rape. Rape by a beast or by a god. Sexual pursuit is pretty well restricted on Athenian painted pottery to gods and heroes, but no pursuing god displays his sexual excitement so blatantly. The only god who does that is the Hermes of the Herm, a figure who's going nowhere very fast. Identities are under pressure here. Do we really know what we see when we classify on the basis of the clothes they wear? That question was not raised only in the context of the symposium, nor only in the case of men. Take something you've already seen today, the extraordinary Ludovisi throne, so-called, a piece whose genuineness seems to me to be more likely to be guaranteed than undermined by its unparalleled iconography. The main scene, you should see here, shows two young women helping a third young woman up and holding in front of her a piece of heavy cloth. All wear ketones of fine fabric, though not of uniformly fine fabric, since the ketone of the woman on the left falls differently across her legs from that of the figure on the right, where the garment maintains the verticality of its folds even over the legs. And the garment of the central figure clings to her body to reveal navel, rib cage, and breasts. As on Smicros Sicter, everything here is about the relationship of clothing to the body and about what clothing tells us of the body underneath, about the ambiguous relationship between clothing and nakedness, clothing and nudity. That's a relationship only further emphasized on the two ends of the throne. On the right-hand end, a heavily draped woman with ketone, covered with a thick himation, tightly bound around her body and limbs and pulled up over her head, sits holding a box from which she picks out grains of incense to cast into the burner standing in front of her. On the left-hand end, a naked young woman leans back, cross-legged, on a cushion, playing the double aulos, her hair alone covered. It's tempting to see sacred contrasted with secular here, but the double aulos was as much part of religious sacrifices as of bawdy revels. And if incense was the smell of the religious sanctuary, it was also the smell of heightened sensory awareness. Sound and smell are added here to the strong sense of tactility already emphasized on the front of the throne. Art doesn't come much more material than this, nor does our ability to pigeonhole find itself more dramatically challenged. What identities are we to suppose these figures adopt? The heavy drapery of the woman feeding the incense burner and the undress of the aulos player raise this question most sharply. Does the nudity indicate that the aulos player is a sex worker? Does the heavy drapery of the other woman indicate her high status as well as her respectability? The main scene complicates this. If the female figure being lifted up is Aphrodite, starring in a scene where both she and those helping her are drawing attention to their bodies by their clothing, then the nudity of the aulos player constitutes an acknowledgement of Aphrodite. The clothing of the figure with the incense burner, a denial. Do we transport these end figures into real life and find the nudity vulgar and the respectable clothing proper? Or do we stay in the realm of the figurative and find the nudity appropriate and the heavy clothing an act of defiance? As with the Parthenon frieze and the Pan painter's crater, so here, the mythological divine context changes the rules about dress and bodily comportment. We ignore this intersectionality at our peril. So the more closely we look at what figures wear in classical Greek representations, the more clear it becomes that for all that the range of clothing was in many ways quite limited, in fact, there was a great deal of scope, both for wearing items of clothing in different ways and for combining those items differently. What's more, the same garment might be worn to very different effects depending on the material used, linen or wool, and on how heavy the linen or wool garment was, even before entering into the question of silk, use of which is attested, but its prevalence uncertain. And this still leaves out the important question of colour. Scholars have often sought to consign functions to individuals on the basis of their dress, but to do so is to ignore that there's a language of clothes and that not every statement made is a statement about long-term identity, any more than it's a statement about legal status. No two occasions are the same. Different groups develop their own range of acceptable dress options, whether formalized in office rules or simply imbibed by observation. Athenian pottery enables us to see that the world of the symposium was a world in which there were a very wide range of interpretations of what dress and behavior was appropriate, just like the world of the English pub. Athenian ceramics explore that range, plausibly going well beyond what was actually to be observed in life. But, as in the modern world, decisions about how to materialize the identity you wished others to recognize were not required merely in the case of parties. And we need to be conscious that identity and dress were a matter of constant negotiation, in which desire to display or hide one's wealth, job, age, sex, sexuality, or ethnic origin were always involved. Thank you very much.